Okay, welcome everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy Evacuation Day. I'm Ron Sorrow, President of Lynnfield Historical Society. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. And last time I spoke too soon about the spring coming, but this time for sure, spring's here. Friday is going to be spring, so technically winter's just going to be over. Okay, so today is actually the 250th anniversary of Evacuation Day. So we've invited local historian Dan Gagnon to come in to discuss the actual history of the day. When, after an 11-month siege, the Continental Army liberated Boston on March 17, 1776, ending the British presence in Massachusetts forever. Dan Gagnon is the author of A Salem Witch, the Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse, and has spoken widely on Massachusetts history, including events related to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Dan is currently teaching French at BB High. Please welcome tonight's guest speaker, Dan Gagnon.
Thank you very much, Ron.
Okay.
Is this on? Can you hear me all in the back? All right, well, thank you very much for having me back here at Lynnfield Historical Society. I had been here before talking about the witch trials. It's quite a different topic tonight, and I'm very happy to share it with you. Normally, if I speak, I try not to have papers in front of me. I do this evening because as we go through, I have a few quotes from some original documents that I wanted to use, and so that's why I'm here with my nice little stack in my podium. The teacher in me never wants to have something in my hand or be
Stay
reading.
close to the mic.
Oh, yep. Or be reading. So this evening, we are here on the perfect day to talk about Evacuation Day. It is the actual 250th anniversary. It is also St. Patrick's Day, which is why I went with my green, naturally. Now, with us in Massachusetts, we are in a sense spoiled with so much Revolutionary War history. Our part, though, in terms of local events, is kind of ending tonight in terms of the 250th. As the British are leaving Boston, really the American Revolution goes elsewhere, and it'll go different places. So although the 250th events continue, our year's almost up. Our year, of course, started back on Patriots Day, really well before that. And so my first segment here is going to be talking about what happens early on in 1775. We're going to talk about the Siege of Boston as it develops. We'll talk about the evacuation, and then quickly at the end, we can talk about the monument and how it did become a holiday in Boston and Suffolk County. Excellent. So, of course, our story, our real lightning round, catching up to speed here, of course, begins April 19, 1775, Lexington and Concord and Menotomy, the first shots of the Revolution. We have militiamen pouring out from all of these towns surrounding Boston. I have a little map of the British retreat back to Boston. That's really when our siege of Boston begins, is chasing them back. We got North Bridge out here, all the way back. You have the Danvers and surrounding towns militias intercept them at Menotomy. As they're heading back to Boston, the British decide they don't know if it's actually safe to try to go the way they came. So they go across to Charlestown. They almost get cut off by the Salem militia, and the Salem militia instead just stops. And they are able to get back because they were not intercepted like they were kind of supposed to be. They have all their ships in the harbor here, and they're able just to be ferried over into Boston, and the siege is on. The reason we have, we have such a long gap between this, Patriots Day, and Evacuation Day, basically 11 months, almost exactly 11 months, is really due to the geography of Boston and the Royal Navy. That really extends our story. You're going to have a lot of time of people mostly sitting around, digging a lot of trenches, looking across the harbor at each other, and not much fighting, with a few notable exceptions. We have this whole group around Boston. You're going to end up with Massachusetts soldiers below Boston Neck, as well as Rhode Island soldiers. They're going to send the Connecticut Provincial Army up by Charlestown. We have New Hampshire troops, and nobody at the beginning is exactly sure who's in charge of this. What was their goal? Their goal is to chase the British back, and they did that. So is it done? Can we all go home? What happens next? Of course, when news of this spreads throughout the colonies, it really is a revolution, and it is on. Most people do not go home. They stay around Boston. And even more so, they're going to send people out to a couple other places. They send Benedict Arnold all the way out through Western Mass into New York to take Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen, one of those forts along like the Lake Champlain corridor that would eventually lead up to Montreal if you had kept going up north. This will later on matter to our event. Basically, they just sneak in. Sneak in at night, run past a guard, and there's enough of them that they can just take the fort. With around Boston, we have Bunker Hill, which was also a local holiday for a while, Bunker Hill Day, not so much actually anymore. And this kind of sets our final piece for the next 10 months. With the Battle of Bunker Hill, it will be taking place here in Charlestown. The American lines after Patriots Day are here. You can see these little, like, meant to be dug fortifications. You can see there's a couple little, like, forts around here. Cambridge, that's Cambridge back then, is their headquarters. But the harbor is full of the Royal Navy ships with guns far larger than anything that the Patriots, being militiamen, they don't really have heavy artillery in any sort of a way. It's just the gun on their back, more than they could muster. One of the really early ideas, and it's an idea that takes us through to Evacuation Day, is trying to seize strategic positions that could overlook the city of Boston. Bunker Hill is the first try, and try number 2 doesn't happen until the week before Evacuation Day. So try number 1, of course, we know Bunker Hill. The Patriots sneak over at night. They start digging fortifications that overlook Charlestown, overlook the harbor. And what is really interesting about this is it's well thought out. It's well planned. They know to go right as it gets dark so that the British won't see them. Everything seems to be going fine. The wind blows the wrong way. And all of that sound blows across the harbor, and so it really was never a secret. The British in downtown Boston heard about it immediately. They could prepare, and that's why the following morning we got the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was a full frontal assault by the British Army on that position. Bunker Hill matters because it's going to set some British expectations. The British win, so to speak. They take the hill. The Americans end up being forced back over this little narrow neck of lands into Cambridge. Here are their lines. They actually pull back a little bit. And the British will fortify that. What seems like a loss is actually great. I have a couple quotes from the British about Bunker Hill. We have one British officer who afterwards says, "We shall soon be driven from the ruins of our victory. Our generals came over in high spirits and expected rather to punish a mob than fight with troops that would look them in the face. There is an air of dejection through all our superiors, which forebodes no good and does not look as things ought after a victory." The so-called winners know right away that they have not really won because of such high casualties it took to take this hill that did not immediately change the game. There's one lieutenant colonel who had been fighting up the hill into the Patriot redoubt. You often see, well, I guess really, like my image before. That's on top of the hill, and you have the British coming with bayonets, charging the Patriot soldiers. One of those British officers is in bed in Boston, dying the week after Bunker Hill. He got shot storming the redoubt. And his quote to his compatriots is, "My friends, we have fought in a bad cause, and therefore I have my reward." That they realized when they met those Americans that their determination not to yield, not to run away, they knew right away that that was a giant miscalculation. And then you get Nathaniel Greene, who is a general from Rhode Island, who lastly says, "I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price." The Patriots knew right away that they had something on that day. Now, what we had up until that point is 4 independent armies: Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Each colony had a major general in charge of their provincial forces, and sort of just out of respect, they all kind of decided to listen to the Massachusetts major general since they were in his backyard on his home turf, but technically it's 4 independent commands. Congress will appoint General Washington, of course, to take charge of these forces, and he's the one who will be in charge through to Evacuation Day. So here's his arrival on the green at Cambridge. Washington heard about Bunker Hill, the battle, while he was on his way riding to Boston, so he is not present for this, and he shows up about 2 weeks afterwards, and he has a lot of thoughts about Bunker Hill. Not necessarily strategically on board with their decision, but it turned out well, so it's okay. You know, he's not really going to be critical of that. He does have a lot of thoughts about New Englanders. He is a Southern gentleman. He comes from Virginia, where the government was really more of a aristocracy of the wealthy landowners were the only people elected to the state legislatures. It's very different than colonial Massachusetts that had really a lot of commonality and more egalitarian society than the South. This will be some problems because almost all the soldiers he's in charge of are these New Englanders that he doesn't really like. He, after his arrival, wrote to his cousin that New Englanders were, quote, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people. And he continued that there was an unaccountable kind of stupidity in the lower classes of these people, which, believe me, prevails but too generally among the officers of the Massachusetts part of the army. So we are going to see some real intercolonial butting of heads. His staff of officers are basically all still New Englanders, because that's who's around. He comes up north, just behind him, are going to be some Virginia and Pennsylvania riflemen that come as reinforcements, and so the New Englanders are thrilled to have these reinforcements. And in fact, that's why they had picked someone from the southern colonies to be in charge, in order to sort of drag the other colonies into the war too, because so far it's just New England against Britain. It's only the 4 colonies against Britain, and you had to try to make it 13 if you wanted to win. So that's important. Washington also has an issue in that he is, of course, a Virginian slave owner. And in the militia of Massachusetts, we have a lot of free black soldiers, really citizens, not really soldiers yet. These free black citizens, and there's this immediate tension of, can you have free black soldiers if your general's a Virginia slave owner? How do you kind of square this? And as he took command, they immediately stopped recruiting black soldiers for the army. So that was an immediate switch as soon as he comes to Cambridge. Now, in terms of what Washington experiences, he really kind of thinks he's been misled and kind of shoehorned into this job. He was told there were 20,000 New England troops around Boston. There's only 14,000, and some of them just kind of decide to go home whenever they want because they never signed a contract. They're not like really in the army. He doesn't like that. The other thing is he had been told that there were more than 300 barrels of gunpowder. There was actually only 90. So this is after Bunker Hill. So if there was another battle, each American patriot soldier could shoot 9 times, and that was it. Whoa. So you're really not ready for like a general engagement, an actual battle against the British. And Washington, in his mind, is really going to be haunted by that. He's constantly afraid that the British in Boston are going to find out about that and come charging out of Boston, and just the American lines will disintegrate and the siege is broken. He really thinks that's a possibility. The British are not going to be that bold. It's just not really going to happen. But in his mind, it is. We have the moment he's told in Cambridge of this gunpowder shortage. The Major General from New Hampshire, General Sullivan, says that George Washington sat still for half an hour after he was told how little powder there was flabbergasted that they had all these men and all these guns, and they couldn't even really use them much. Cambridge itself is a colonial town. It's not Boston, but it's a decent-sized one. It had some real wealthy houses, a real built-up downtown. There are plenty of people who may have worked in Boston in high positions in the government, for example, like the royal government before the Revolution, but they lived in Cambridge because it was just seen as nicer. And it is turned entirely into an army camp. There's tents on the green. There's tents in the backyards of the houses. Some of these houses of loyalists are seized to be used as barracks. And we have these descriptions of just the town totally changed. What used to be great manicured gardens is now where you're going to keep all the donkeys that haul supplies for the army. And how the town really does kind of suffer in a way. On the other hand, a lot of the town is empty because there were so many loyalists that after Lexington and Concord, they fled into the city of Boston. With Washington, they are going to try to expand the war further. We had Ticonderoga over here was where they went and captured already. Washington's going to send Benedict Arnold up to Quebec, up there. But for the most part, other than the Quebec campaign, I suppose, what's going on other places is really small. The Boston is the focus of the war at this point in time. We have our map. When the summer continues, Washington is intent on training the men. He thinks they're insubordinate, and they kind of were. In many ways, they still don't get along with the other colonies. The Virginia riflemen keep picking fights with the Massachusetts boys, and it leads to a lot of problems. George Washington himself breaks up fistfights because he just happens to be the officer going by as some of these happen. But you don't think of your commander-in-chief as, it's not really his job. With the siege, there are some small guns on the American side that they'll have at these larger forts that could kind of reach into Charlestown. Charlestown's been abandoned, mostly burned. What's left, the British use as a barracks for their forts there and their fort there. They occasionally will shoot cannonballs at each other, but it's just a lot of sitting around. There's a loyalist in the city of Boston who had written at the time of the cannonballs going by. At one time, a horse would be knocked in the head. Another time, a man would be killed. It seemed to be rather more in jest than in earnest. Sometimes a shell would play in the air like a rocket, rather in diversion and burst without damage. Now and then another would fall on the town and burst to the terror or breaking of a few panes of glass. Little else was done but keeping both armies out of the way of idleness. So not really taking that too seriously. And one of the British officers who was directly across from the American lines here, so at the end of Charlestown, described the situation as the regulars and the provincials squint at one another like wild cats across a gutter. Good one. And with our divisions of the continental forces, we're still really just the provincial forces. We're going to have General Israel Putnam, originally from Danvers, but he's the Connecticut Major General at this point. He's the one out here on these lines by Cambridge. You've General Thomas and General Ward of Massachusetts who are down here, and of course Washington is in a house in Cambridge. When September comes, Washington considers attacking the city of Boston. There's kind of quite a few reasons for him to consider this. First of all, the goal is to liberate Boston, so kind of in their mind the whole time was how they could enter an engagement that they could actually win. They're going to find out that they're really not ready every time they're going to go to try this. But especially for Washington, Washington is in charge of this army, and every victory that army had won was before he got there. He hasn't really done much other than drill them around and train them, and it seems to be from some of his letters he's starting to realize, I got to earn my keep. I got to do something now that I'm in charge of these men. And with Washington overall, he's picked, as we mentioned, because he was a Southern leader, could bring the other colonies in. Washington did have a military career in the French and Indian War that consisted entirely of defeats. So they have picked a general who's never won a battle in his entire life to be in charge of the army. Bold, really bold choice. his idea is storming the city from Cambridge. They had some small flat-bottom boats, like really just flat-bottom rowboats, and it's something that they could make more of. And the idea was Cambridge, the northern Cambridge troops under General Putnam, could, the Charles River is really shallow, and you can see these are all like mud flats and such. Amphibious assault on the city of Boston across the Charles River. They have one advantage over the British, and that is more soldiers. They don't have the right guns, they don't have enough gunpowder, they don't have the right equipment, but there's more of them. And that is sort of seen as the advantage. The reason he starts to push it in the fall is also because of supplies and the idea that a bunch of these guys had shown up in April and nobody brought a winter coat. They don't have any blankets. Winter's coming, and this is seen as a problem. The enlistment, eventually after he gets there, they do sign enlistment contracts through December, some of them, and all of them would expire January 1st. So after January 1st, you didn't know how many men you were going to have. Your advantage in men might go away, in numbers, I mean, your advantage in numbers. You also had some people who were still kind of just leaving and going home. So as more time went on, you were kind of trickling away some of your soldiers. But in particular, with Cambridge, there's not enough firewood. Washington puts it to them that they're going to have to start chopping down fences and chopping up, like, not the houses that they were using as barracks, but like the outbuildings, the sheds. They're going to have to burn every stick of wood in that town in order to make it through the winter. Now, he calls a council of war, which is him and all of his generals, which he does several times. When Congress picked him to lead, they said that all of his plans for an engagement had to be approved by the other generals, which is kind of a good check on him. The other generals had a lot more experience than him. In September, all the other generals vote unanimously no. They do not like this plan. They do not think it's a good plan. And the problem is, if you're going to cross the Charles River in all of these tiny little boats, the giant warships of the Royal Navy will just pick you apart. Absolutely would pick you apart. And until this point, also, every engagement that those American Patriot troops had, they're always like standing behind something.
Yeah.
On Bunker Hill, they had dug trenches that they were behind. Lexington and Concord, they're behind rock walls, they're behind trees. They were never really like out there in the open. And they were concerned whether they would stand and fight in a storming the beach type situation, which was probably a reasonable situation. Now, September, generals vote no. October, he calls them together again. Like, basically the same plan he proposes again. The reason he does this is kind of political. Congress wants to know why he hasn't done anything yet. They sent him there, and not much has happened. So they vote that, and a resolution that they mail to Washington saying, you should attack as soon as you think you can. Like, get going here, guy, get going, get going. And they're going to send a committee out to meet with him. So Washington calls another council of war right before the committee is going to come. He knows the generals are going to vote no again. But now it's not his fault. You know, it's the other general's fault that they're not attacking. And so it kind of gives him some cover because he is realizing that no, his plan from before was not excellent. It's not going to work. When the committee comes, the other thing they have in mind is reorganization of the army. January 1st, all those enlistments are up. January 1st is the day they switch from the Army of New England and a few guys from Virginia to the Continental Army. It's January 1st. And Congress wants to make sure that plan's going along well. Are you signing people up for January 1st, at which point all those people signed year-long contracts starting January 1st to January 1st? They're afraid everyone's going to go home on New Year's Eve. If it's not in writing, they can leave. And so that's kind of the screws they're tightening on Washington and his people. We have, again, the issue of who's allowed in the Army. So they had stopped recruiting free black citizens, soldiers. That's going to change because the governor of Virginia is going to promise freedom to any enslaved person whose master was a rebel, not if their master was loyal to the British. But if their master was a rebel and they joined the British forces, or if you were a free black person and you joined the British forces, you would not be enslaved in the future. And there's this sudden shift on that issue where they're afraid around Boston some of the soldiers of color might leave December 31st and the morning of January 1st put on a British uniform because they're going to be treated better. And they're like, hold on. So they have to totally reverse their idea. They are going to start recruiting black soldiers right away because they are in a sense, afraid that the British are going to use that as an advantage against them. With that, we have many comments from people in Massachusetts, like Abigail Adams, who thought this was really good, that you should be, anyone willing to fight for American freedom should be included, was really the gist of her remarks. He continues to butt heads with people in Massachusetts as to what's the long-term game plan. The New Englanders are skeptical that any sort of get in a bunch of boats and go over to Boston is going to work at any point in the near future, even with better equipment if they could get it. And you have the Major General of Massachusetts, General Ward, down on these lines, who had constantly, since Bunker Hill, been basically advocating to do it again. Not in Charlestown, because now the British have dug in, it's fortified, you're never really going to take that back, or at least not easily. But down here you have the same thing. You have hills overlooking the city of Boston that are empty. Neither side took them. Mm-hmm. It's just empty. It's an empty hill that is almost just as, strategically valuable as the one they did in June. And Washington isn't immediately interested in that. The British considered sending out soldiers to seize the Dorchester Heights here. They had a whole plan. They're going to send 2,000. Royal Navy was going to cover them as they came in. It seemed like a good plan, and it really they can't get over Bunker Hill, and they're just afraid that's going to happen to them again. The British are not willing to take a risk. They really got burned once, and they won't again. So Washington talks to this congressional committee, and the question he puts to them was, the general wishes to know how far it may be deemed proper and advisable to avail himself of this season to destroy the troops, the British troops, who propose to winter in Boston by a bombardment. When the harbor is blocked up, if there's too much ice, the British couldn't really leave. Or, in other words, whether the loss of the town and the property therein are to be so considered. Washington asked Congress, I've been ordered to take this city. Do you care if I burn it to the ground while I'm doing so? Is this a problem? He's really asking them, how far are you willing to go? Where's my line here? And they're not willing to lose the entire city of Boston. And so they tell him, no, please don't turn it all into matchsticks, because then we get our city back and it's just empty and it's all burned, and that defeats the purpose. One of the reasons they are less sympathetic is most of the people that had been in Boston with the British are actually loyalist refugees from other parts of Massachusetts. But you do still have plenty of Bostonians of whatever political opinions that are still living in their houses as just bystanders, or even some patriots that were taken hostage. They took the selectmen of Boston hostage, for example. They were very much patriots, but they could not, them and their families could not leave. So, the British are going to have some shifts throughout this siege. General Gage had been in charge since way back. He was the governor of Massachusetts, the military governor, and in May, right before Bunker Hill, we have three generals that join him, Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne. These generals sent over by London, kind of immediately seen as the probably there to eventually replace General Gage, because royal government didn't think General Gage had done so well. I mean, an entire revolution against him started, so he's probably not doing well as the royal governor. They arrived before Bunker Hill, these three. They are involved in Bunker Hill. They've been there for like a month. As time goes on, Gage is going to hear in September that he's fired. It's not till September, but it's because of Bunker Hill. It took a while for that news to get to London. When they hear it, they're like, we got to get rid of this guy. The letter comes back from London in September, and he's canned over that. So it's months later, but that really is the cause and effect. Howe, that fall, is in charge. He's the one who's top, and the other two are below him. Howe receives orders to leave Boston in November, but evacuation day is not November, this is March. And he writes back to London saying he actually can't abandon the city of Boston. He doesn't have enough boats. Troop transports, not warships, but like the troop transports. They also want to take out all these loyalists with them that have fled to their protection, and they definitely don't have enough boats for that. Winter's coming. It's just not practical. He does tell London, though, there's no problem in waiting. We are not under the least apprehension of an attack on this place. He's not worried at all. He doesn't think anybody's going to attack Boston. You have thousands of soldiers around it, but he's not worried in the least. And he continues writing to the Prime Minister, on the contrary, it were to be wished that they would attempt so rash a step and quit those strong entrenchments in which alone they may attribute their present security. He wants George Washington to bring it on because he knows he's going to win, that he has the advantage. And so it's good that the other generals kept kind of vetoing Washington's idea of attack. British in Boston, though, that winter, their mood is going to be desperate. Big smallpox outbreak. There becomes questions for Washington and the officers of the British do at some point end up being willing to let some people leave Boston, and the Americans, the Patriots, have to decide, but do we let them leave and give our entire army smallpox along the way? Because some people had it, some people had not had it, especially the younger soldiers had not. Somehow, when it had gone through New England, the older soldiers like Washington, like Israel Putnam, they had smallpox in their youth, but a lot of the young militia guys had not. And so they think this is a real problem there. They have mass graves in the city of Boston because of this outbreak. They're burying people in parks. They're burying people on the common. There's nothing that they can do about it. There's one British soldier who writes, "Our barracks are all hospitals, and so offensive is the stench of the wounds that the very air is infected with the smell. What in God's name are you about in England? Have you forgotten us?" That this morale is really plummeting. They're going to destroy buildings in Boston to use as firewood, because they're also desperate. You don't have a lot of trees in Boston, as you're also trying to last the winter. They destroy historic sites from early Puritan settlement, like old meeting houses. They use the Old South Meeting House as a horse stable for the dragoons. And Faneuil Hall becomes a theater. Faneuil Hall had been the meeting place of the Boston Town Meeting. We have all these great Patriot speeches that were there. And it's repurposed as a theater, which Massachusetts people still don't really like that. Theater had always been banned, going way back to the Puritans. They think it's really offensive that the British open up a theater. They think it's ungodly. They really don't like that. I don't know, to us that doesn't seem like a big deal probably, but to them this was like another slight, another offense against America. Now, the Americans know that they're doing a little better. So Prospect Hill is where General Putnam's army was in Cambridge. Bunker Hill, of course, is one of the British positions. They have this printed, and people in London start handing this out. American propaganda, just people on the streets handing out American propaganda, trying to turn the British against their own war. So here, you want to be with the Americans? You get $7 a month. Fresh provisions and in plenty. Health, that's pretty good. Freedom, ease, affluence, and a good farm. They might be overselling it a little bit. That sounds a little too rosy. Or do you want to be with the British? 3 pence a day, rotten salt pork, the scurvy, slavery, beggary, and want. We don't really think, most people think of the American Revolution of trying to win popular opinion in London. Most of the revolution is so focused on trying to turn the loyalists in America to the patriot cause, not so much those in Britain. As winter approaches, there will be some further advancements by the Americans towards the city. We have out here the American lines. General Putnam orders men to seize these hills and fortify them, that one, and all the way here at Lechmere Point as well, are going to be dug in and fortified.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
Did normal people go in and out of like the cities back then? Or was it just soldiers?
It is almost entirely cut off. And it could easily be cut off because there is just the one road. If you wanted to cross in and out of Boston, you'd have to go through the American lines, they'd have to let you, through 2 different rows of forts. Then you had this big gap, and then you had 3 British lines, and they typically would only let you through if you could prove some pressing business or have a pass from an officer on either side. There are a couple examples of basically just important people that were allowed either in or out, but pretty much no average person was crossing in and out. And with that, those lines, you can see why they never even consider really like attacking there. That was never going to happen. They did have a literal gate, a fortified wall, like, taller than a person, fortified wall, not just trenches. That was never going to happen. That's why they thought about the boat idea, because it's really not a great idea. But it was better than that. So as Putnam leads the American forces right up to the edge of the Charles, it's kind of interesting that they thought this would cause an enormous pushback. Not necessarily another Bunker Hill of the British all coming out, but they thought that there would be more pushback, and they don't really get much. They have some small cannons, the Americans at this point. They bring them up to Lechmere, and when they do this, it means the Royal Navy can no longer come on this side. They can't come into the Charles River, or they could be fired upon, and the British are not willing to take those risks. And so that works. When they were digging the fortifications and moving the cannons close, yeah, the British ships shoot at them, but it wasn't much, and they kind of kept going, and they didn't suffer many losses. So they sort of win that strategic move. And this is their first real, strategic gain in months. They really have not been doing much for months. George Washington doesn't like this. He doesn't understand why the British didn't fight back. He says that he was unable upon any principle whatsoever to account for their silence, unless it be to lull us into a fatal security. He thinks that there's some sort of trap here, and he hasn't figured out what the trap is, but he thinks there's a trap. There really was not a trap. The British just weren't interested in doing anything about it. First of all, the British are hoping to leave at some point. Secondly, the tradition was you never campaigned in the winter. The traditional European war, you started in March, and you'd fight all year long to October, and then everybody kind of went home. And then you showed up again in March, and you fought for 6 months, and then you all kind of went home. Obviously, the British aren't going home, but they're just in their barracks, their winter quarters. So the British don't even really plan moves in the winter. That's not what they do, whereas the Americans would fight at any point in time. Our real break, as we are getting to Evacuation Day, is a big move. We have all the way up at Fort Ticonderoga, that fort that was taken back in May. There was a reason I mentioned it, even though it didn't really seem important probably at the time. That fort had been built to defend, way back in the French and Indian War, against the French in Canada. It has giant guns. And it's the only place that the Americans have really captured giant, heavy artillery. These cannons they're measured in pounds. They are anything from a 4-pounder gun to a 24-pounder gun. Now, it's not that the gun weighs that much, it's that the cannonball weighs that much. So the 24-pounder guns were enormous and could do immense damage to, ships that the Royal Navy has in Boston Harbor. They could shoot far enough to hit Boston itself. And so this is the sort of strategic game changer they need. The problem is it's 300 miles away, And some of it isn't even like roads. Well, you have a resource, a tool that you can use, but it just doesn't seem practical. It doesn't seem possible. It's something that really is fascinating. It was considered even in the first point because it's so bold, and it's something the British never could have anticipated. Yeah, General Howe in Boston, he heard the Americans had taken Ticonderoga in May, and he probably didn't care in the least. Hundreds of miles away. Like, why is that his problem? It really isn't, but it becomes his problem. So they're going to send Henry Knox, who had been a family of Irish immigrants, so St. Patrick's Day kind of ropes us back in here, all the way up to Ticonderoga, because he convinces Washington, I can go get those and bring them back to you. And he does. What he does is he is going to go, first he actually goes all the way to New York City and then up to Ticonderoga. And he is going to use 42 horse-drawn sleds. The plan had been to get a bunch of oxen, and they couldn't find enough and they couldn't afford them. So they had to settle for horses. They had to go from Ticonderoga down Lake George in flat-bottom boats, some of which start to sink and they almost lose them, but they don't. The water had gone all the way up to the gunnels of the boat, and they're like bailing them out as, you know, half the people are rowing and half are bailing, but it worked. They get them to the Hudson River, they come all the way down to Albany, and that's where the even worse part happens. You're going to drag them on sleds all the way to Boston. This is where the horses come in. They have to cross rivers like the Hudson itself. They go out ahead of time. They are very clever. They went out days ahead of time and intentionally broke the ice. They intentionally put holes in the ice so that water would bubble up and refreeze, and now it's even thicker than it was before you started, whereas you think poking a bunch of holes in the ice is not going to help your cause. It actually was, and so they managed to get all the way down, all the way out to Westfield, pulling across the snow, these cannons. Then the weather warms up and the snow melts and they're stuck in the mud. Flaw, real significant flaw. But the weather improves or gets worse, depending, I guess, on your opinion. It gets colder, and they're able to keep continuing through November, through December, as they're approaching the city of Boston. You have this real positive development. Meanwhile, you're going to have real issues back in December in Boston. All these enlistments are coming up. Not every soldier was actually all the way through to December 31st. For some reason, all the Connecticut people signed up until December 10th. It's just what that colony did. Just seems strange. Guess you can go home by Christmas, and but it's weird. And there were soldiers who, militiamen, provincial soldiers, who kind of had enough at that point in time. They came out on Patriots Day. They kind of felt like they did what was needed of them and they were going to go home. There were others who basically didn't like the new management of the Continental Army that was going to start January 1st and had enough there. And in part, they didn't like the idea that they were all going to be jumbled up. You'd have an individual small unit, might all be from one colony, but you'd be in a division of people from all over. George Washington wrote to Philip Schuyler, who was in upstate New York, Connecticut wants no Massachusetts man in their corps. Massachusetts think there is no necessity for a Rhode Islander to be introduced among them. And New Hampshire says it's very hard that her valuable and experienced officers should be discarded. That they do not really get along. Washington also is going to get feedback about some bad things he had said about the New Englanders that Congress heard about, which is a problem. He had an aide-de-camp. It kind of goes on to be his, like, more of his chief of staff, a guy whose last name is Reed, and he writes to him in December pointing out that some of the congressmen are displeased, in particular the New England congressmen, about what he said. And Washington writes back, I'm much obliged to you for those hints. I will endeavor a reformation, as I can assure you, my dear Reed, that I wish to walk such a line as will give the most general satisfaction. He thinks that might cost him his job because of this rumors, The Connecticut soldiers are going to be the problem here, though. Their enlistment's up December 10th. A bunch of them decide to go home on the 3rd. They just decide they're done. They're done early. Let's go home. Why are we going to wait another week? Nothing's happening. What's going on? And remember, the one advantage they have is their numbers. 25% of your army, roughly, because it's 4 colonies. I mean, obviously, it's not really proportional among the 4. But if one of the 4 colonies all disappears, the British can break your lines. If the British know the Connecticut troops are leaving, and they're always watching with their telescopes from Boston, they see everything that's going on in the American lines up close. What happens is they send General Putnam, because he was originally, he was the Connecticut Major General, out to stop them. And he pulls his horse, he's riding his horse down the road as all this kind of ragtag Connecticut guys going home are there, and he tries to convince them to stay. Stay the one more week, that way our position isn't weakened. And they are so ready to go home, one soldier yells, "Damn you," and punched General Putnam's horse in the face. He gets court-martialed and 39 lashes. You do not punch the general's horse. That is, or say "damn you" to the general. That, really, really bad. They considered that a much more significant curse than we might. And this leads to a real crisis that New Hampshire and Massachusetts have to, again, call out their temporary militia. Sullivan, one of the generals from New Hampshire, writes back to New Hampshire saying, "Send us anybody you can. Do not wait for them all to meet up. Send them in small groups the moment they get my letter." That he really thinks that their lines are going to be open to the British and it will all fall apart. Fortunately, the British are not prepared to make a move. We get to January 1st. We get to our new Continental Army. The Americans, patriots in Cambridge, had been flying the New England flag. In Putnam's camp, we do know is the red standard version, and they had been since Bunker Hill, because it started out as it was just the New Englanders. What we end up getting is, and Putnam and those troops had a 24-foot tall flagpole, so that all the British in Boston could see their flag. They captured a small British gunboat, and they took the mast and turned it into a giant flagpole. And what, with the first day of the Army's existence, Washington tells them that it's time to change the flag. And there's a whole debate among historians as to, okay, so everyone agrees they took that flag down, January 1st, cool. Which one did they put up? And this is something that there are reasons for both. In that part of Cambridge that's now Somerville, they always fly that one. The 13 stripes and the Union flag in the corner. From what the British letters say was that the Americans just straight up flew the Union flag. Because they're really confused. The British are incredibly confused. Why did they take down their rebel flag and put up the Union Jack? Did we win? Are they surrendering? Is the war over? And they really think this. That day had been, the king in Britain gives a speech to the opening of Parliament whenever there's a new session. The King's Speech, the whole movie with the King's Speech and such. The copy, it had happened 2 months prior or whatever, but it arrived in Boston, where the king called the Americans traitors, said they were trying to erect an independent empire, that they were, once again, beyond his protection, so on and so on. And it infuriates the Americans. They're going to burn copies of the King's Speech in Cambridge, which is not a big surprise. But the British think the Americans got copies of the speech and realized that they were wrong all along, and that the king was against them, which sounds preposterous. Washington hears of this from the British, and they really don't know. They don't get it. They don't understand what is happening. And Washington has a line. I presume they begin to think it's strange that we've not made a formal surrender of our lines yet. I added the word yet. He just said formal surrender of our lines. But that is our new Continental Army. There are also fights among the colonies as to whose generals got to stay in the Continental Army, because they had too many generals and who didn't. January to March is our end game. here. We are heading to Evacuation Day. First up, we have what I think is one of the funniest days of the entire siege of Boston, and it really hasn't been a funny event in any way so far, but this is a funny event. So, January 8th, General Putnam is going to send some people back to Charlestown for the first time since Bunker Hill. Now, yeah, they got all these forts, there's only one road in, one road out. No, not going to do that. It's January. You can walk across the water. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to raid Charlestown and burn any of the houses that are left because the British are using them as barracks. So that's the price to be paid. The British officers are in Faneuil Hall, their theater, for a play. And they are kind of excited about this play. It was written by General Burgoyne, one of those three generals that was sent over. He thought he was a great playwright in addition to a great general, and I'm not quite sure he was either, but that was his impression. And the play is The Blockade of Boston. All officer cast. You have these British officers as, like, kind of themselves, I guess. You also have some who are wearing makeup being ladies in the play, because it's all British officers, the entire cast. And so the play begins, cool, fine. Someone gets up as, this caricature of George Washington that's ridiculous. It was described by someone present as the guy who was Washington walked in an uncouth gait with a large wig, a long rusty sword, attended by a country servant with a rusty gun, like he's some hillbilly leader or something. And as they're beginning this play, there's several British soldiers that burst onto the stage from the backstage sides. And they yell, "The Yankees are attacking our works on Bunker Hill." The audience laughs, they clap, they cheer. They've heard this one before. Oh, they're laughing at George Washington. It's great. And then General Howe stands up and says, "Officers to your alarm posts." That wasn't part of the play. That was an attack. And after this order, quote, "a general scene of confusion ensued." Officers, quote, "immediately hurried out of the house to their alarm posts, some skipping over the orchestra, trampling on the fiddles, and in short, everyone making his most speedy retreat. The actors calling out for water to get the paint and smut off their faces, women fainting, etc." Just a great way to end. Women fainting, etc. That's the scene. And their little raid on Charlestown was successful. Clearly the British didn't see it coming in any sort of a way. With that, though, as we get to January, mid-January, Washington is kind of bummed that he hasn't accomplished anything. And we see this in his letters, that he says, "I often thought how much happier I should have been if, instead of accepting of a command under such circumstances, I'd taken my musket upon my shoulder and entered the ranks." He doesn't want to be the guy in charge of this. With this responsibility, he has not succeeded. And the longer you don't succeed, the more it kind of looks like a failure of your command. But Henry Knox shows up January 15th with all those guns. You can imagine the mood immediately changing. So their plan, they had only 9,000 Continental troops. They had 14,000 when Washington showed up. They're down to 9,000. For the next 2 months, February and March, they're going to call out 9,000 militiamen from February 1st to March 31st for their big movement. So these are not actually Continental soldiers. This is like Patriots' Day all over again. Just each town was sending their militia under Washington's command. Washington goes down, sees the soldiers along the river. He knows that they had walked across the river to get into Charlestown. Seems good, seems okay, and he realizes they could walk across the whole river into Boston now. No need for his little small boat idea from before. That seems good. It is a whole different game. Boston isn't really the semi-island that it was anymore. Now, he wants a general assault, just like he had with the little boats, and all the other generals say no again. They still don't think they're ready. You're going to have these really barely trained soldiers charging across a wide open space into a fortified city. Again, they've really only fought hiding behind things before, and that's the officers are unsure. Now, we talked about earlier, all down here, nobody bothers to take it. While the Massachusetts General Ward, even though Washington kept telling him no, hadn't given up on that idea. And he had been sort of on the side requisitioning supplies. Not exactly telling Washington why he had all of this stuff. He had been collecting wood in particular to build barricades. Now, what they came up with is the engineers in the army were going to have basically a prefabricated fort, prefab walls. And that way they could fortify these heights. Bunker Hill was in June. They could just sneak in and dig a hole. You're not going to do that in February. You can't dig trenches in February.
No.
And so that was a flaw. So instead you had to build up, and that's where they had all of this stuff. So they end up having barrels that they fill with rocks and dirt that they're going to haul over. They have these wooden walls that will be full of rocks in the middle that they're going to bring over. They've pre-cut, the word they use is abattis, which is basically a spike. Like you took a tree this wide and you cut a spike on the end like a spear and you put it in the ground and you have a whole bunch of them. And that way the British soldiers aren't really going to charge you because they got to go through all these spikes. At least slow them down as they have to walk around all the spikes and such. So their plan is, again, like Bunker Hill, sneak over at night, set up, sun rises, boy, are those British going to be surprised. Really, it is a very similar plan. Now, as it gets going into March, Charles River isn't frozen anymore, so that whole plan is kind of off, so now they're building a whole ton of boats in Charlestown. Unlike Bunker Hill, they think that if the British do attack Dorchester, knowing they don't have a ton of soldiers left, the British, that if they send a full frontal assault, basically General Putnam could surprise from the rear and land in the city while all the soldiers have now left. Not all the soldiers, but a whole bunch have left. So sort of a second attack. Washington writes to his brother-in-law before this move in early March, talking to him about some land that George Washington, owns in Ohio. And he tells his brother-in-law to basically collect the paperwork because that's where he's going to flee if they lose. So he doesn't have an extraordinarily high level of confidence here. What happens is early March 3rd, March 2nd, these new guns from all around will start firing on the city of Boston. They have solid cannonballs as well as they have shells that are explosives that go into the town and explode. Doesn't do a lot of damage to Boston. It's really sending a message. They actually kind of kill more of their own soldiers because some of their cannons blew up when they tried to fire them. Then they actually hurt the British. But it sends a message. March 3rd, the next night, more fire. March 4th, it'll increase exponentially. This is the big move. So 6.5 miles away, Abigail Adams writes that night, "I could no more sleep than if I had been at the engagement. The rattling of the windows, the jar of the house, and the continual roar of 24-pounders, the bursting of shells, realize a scene to us of which we could scarcely form any conception." She and Braintree had famously gone on a roof and watched Bunker Hill in the distance. And so this is, from her writings, basically bigger than that. We have descriptions of shells raking the houses in Boston. They fire almost 150 shots. And that night at 5:30, it was very foggy. The wind, unlike Bunker Hill, was blowing the right way to hide their sound. And they sent 350 carts from the main Massachusetts part of the Army's camp to Dorchester Heights. These carts have those temporary fortifications. They send detachments of soldiers They lined the road to Dorchester Heights with hay bales the day before, so that if the British were looking, they couldn't really see what was in the carts. They couldn't really see what was going by. It's not really a perfect screen, but it helps somewhat. They have 360 teams of ox and 3,000 specially picked men to accomplish this.
Wow.
Sun comes up, British look out, and they're totally surprised. One British officer wrote he's talking about the fortifications. They were all raised during the night with an expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp. Just totally caught off guard here. One of the people in Boston wrote that General Howe was seen to scratch his head and heard to say by those that were about him that he did not know what he should do, that the provincials had done more work in one night than his whole army would have done in 6 months. So the British do start shooting, as one might expect. The problem is their guns in the city can't hit the Americans. They can shoot that far, but their angle can't get high enough to hit the top of the hill. So they can shoot cannons into the side of the hill, but you're not hitting anyone. That's kind of pointless. So they shoot for about 2 hours and then stop. The British troops form up. They march to the wharfs. They board their transports. They sail out to Castle Island, which back then is an island. It's not connected like it is today, where they rendezvous. They bring ladders with them to scale the American forts. There is one person who describes them as, they looked in general pale and dejected, and said to one another that it would be another Bunker Hill affair or worse. So they're not really excited about it. But they're ordered out to attack those American lines. They rendezvous. Putnam, along with Generals Greene and Sullivan, are on the shore of the Charles River. They have 4,000 more soldiers waiting for their opportunity to come across the river. But the British don't attack. They're out there on their transports around Castle Island, and Howe doesn't order it. He just doesn't. And then a snowstorm blows in, and they all kind of have to sit for the night. But Howe doesn't give the order. He changes his mind after he has them all in the boats, all equipped, all ready to go. And the next day, a British officer comes to the American lines, the one road in and out of Boston, with a letter, and Howe says, if you let us depart in peace, we won't destroy the town. That he's outmaneuvered. He knows that he is done, that the cannons can reach him. He isn't willing to risk another Bunker Hill, that they really have Bunker Hill mindset this whole time, that Bunker Hill has really ruined the whole British perception of this. What happens is there'll be 1,100 Massachusetts loyalists, 9,000 British troops. They just start boarding their transports to leave. Now, for the 1,100 loyalists, most of them, they lived in Massachusetts their whole life, and they're now kind of refugees because of their, wrong political opinions. March 17th itself, we have a description of a really chaotic, rear guard departure from Boston. By 9 a.m. on the 17th, all regiments except for the small rear guard are embarked. They have 3 officers who are the last 3 to get on the last transport out of Long Wharf. Long Wharf was where the British soldiers had first arrived back in 1769, way back because of all the protests and the tea protests and such. So they're leaving from exactly where they had come. They left dummies on the Bunker Hill fortifications, like scarecrows. And so the Americans think, have they left yet? I still see British soldiers there. They're not willing to really chase them out because they're not sure. And the last 3 officers at Long Wharf had been given orders to burn the city if the rebels tried to storm it before they left, but they don't. So they get on their boats and they just leave. Kind of leave. For 2 days, their fleet sits right here. 2 days. They go in and out of Castle Island for a while. And then Their last act is set off the powder magazine in Castle Island and blew that the heck apart. It burned throughout the entire night, and soldiers miles away in Cambridge wrote letters home by the light of Castle Island of all of the explosions. That is it. They're going to go down to, they linger off Hull, which would be all the way down here for a little bit, and then they head to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they are gone. And that is the evacuation. With, this is Washington's first victory. He did it. He won something. He did. He writes to Hancock, who is always described as President Hancock. It can be kind of confusing. He's the President of Congress. Not the President of the United States, but President of Congress. It's with the greatest pleasure I inform you that on Sunday last, the 17th instant, about 9 o'clock in the forenoon, the Ministerial Army, the British, evacuated the town. The forces of the United Colonies are in actual possession. I beg leave to congratulate you, sir, and the Honorable Congress on this happy event. And then the last part, as soon as the ministerial troops quit the town, I ordered 1,000 men who had had the smallpox, under command of General Putnam, who also had the smallpox, to take possession of the heights in the city. They're talking about the heights in the city, the North End, is what he means. They don't actually send the whole army in because they're still afraid of the disease issue. So only people who they knew had the smallpox entered the city. They are going to linger just 2 weeks. On March 29th, the whole bulk of the army is going to go down to New York. They kind of ride off in groups. They had already sent the southern troops away kind of immediately. Then the New Englanders go in groups. They do have a moment of like, wait a minute, where is that whole giant fleet actually going? Do we really know they're going to go to Halifax? Or are they going to pop up somewhere else? So they kind of stick around a little bit. But that's that. And I had one last slide for you, which is, of course, our holiday today.
Yeah.
It is an event that is important in the American Revolution, of course. New York does also have an evacuation day, much later, basically at the end of the war, when the British finally leave New York. Other than that, evacuation day, not a lot of holidays called evacuation day, just us in New York. The 125th anniversary of independence is 1901. And that's really when this first begins to be really considered locally as a really significant event. The state's going to build that monument that's on Telegraph Hill in South Boston. That's one of those hills that they fortified that night. It's the front lawn of South Boston High School is where it is. Boston is going to make it a city holiday. It's still, like free parking in Boston. No meters on evacuation day. And the state will eventually make it a Suffolk County holiday. They have kind of gotten rid of it.
Yep.
State offices are no longer closed anywhere, and that, but it was for a while. So it's still a holiday on the official calendar. It's just not a day off type holiday. It's still on the state calendar, so it counts in that regard. And of course, the city of Boston, naturally. But it is really interesting how we have real, this event, sure, but a lot of events, we have a lot of our memorials that are not actually built in time for 1876, the 100th anniversary of American independence, but that are really kind of built in like the 20 or 30 years following, that really across America, all these revolutionary things start to be built there. Monuments to generals and other things. So this really fits with the whole nationwide idea of trying to remember that. That is what I wanted to share with you this evening. Thank you for coming out. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, thanks. That was great. We're going to have you pull a raffle winner right now.
Oh, big
Right.
responsibility.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Shake them up good.
Not that one.
We have Harold Hands.
Oh,
Yay!
Right.
Anybody have any questions they want to ask?
I had one, but I forgot.
I do. I was wondering if the armies made use of all those different Boston Harbor islands mean, because there are forts, remains of forts out there where they used during that time.
Yeah, so this is a good question. We have many, and I very much cropped this map that there's a whole bunch of other islands, on the other side. We had seen tiny engagements on those islands, especially in kind of around the time of Bunker Hill. The British, having all the ships, thought that the islands were totally safe, and they were using them for storage. They kept herds of sheep out there, things like that, animals, cattle, because they just figured it was easier than downtown Boston. How the heck are the Americans going to get there? Safe. And then, in some instances, the Americans do get there. For example, they knew when you'd have, whichever cycle, the extra low tide that you could get out in some of these gaps. That the British, not being from there, did not know and are really caught off guard there. So you have some small skirmishes there. You have some, like in Chelsea Creek, where they had taken out a small schooner of the British. That's where General Putnam got the giant mast that he was using as a flagpole. But at this point, those are small skirmishes, and there had been an idea similar to Bunker Hill and Dorchester Heights, which was to seize this and try to use that. Raiding the islands and coming back was one thing, but they did kind of feel like they were just going to be totally surrounded by the warships if they tried to. So it was more short-term engagements. But yeah, the islands do come into play, and there are so many of them, which were great pasturage too. So thank you for that.
Anybody else?
Oh, the microphone.
Do you know if any of the British soldiers left and like stayed in, left the army and stayed with the Americans? In the Americas?
There were some British soldiers who were able to desert. Because their morale was wicked low, all these people are getting sick, they, scurvy, like the propaganda said. And we have a few, it's not very many, and it kind of just happens as a trickle during the siege. It's not like on Patriots Day or at Bunker Hill or at one of the main events that happens. It's more just while they're sitting there looking at each other, people could sneak out on a little boat or try to sneak across. In particular, that was so watched and so fortified that wasn't really going to work. But after Bunker Hill and the British are here, and the Americans are right there, that was an area that people from Charlestown is typically where they had a bunch of the deserters, just because you could kind of slip away from your camp more, and the Americans would let you through if you were deserting. This was good, and they wanted to question you. Also, they wanted all the information.
Anybody else?
I don't know if I fell asleep or not, but those guns they dragged from Ticonderoga, what damage did they do? Were they hitting the ships out in the harbor? They dragged them all along, and where were they positioned that made a difference?
Yes. So in particular, these heights, because you could hit the city, which is what they did with them, but it also meant you could cover the harbor.
Right.
And so that is the reason for the departure, was the British realized that their advantage of the Royal Navy was no longer an advantage. That's the counter move. You could shoot them into downtown Boston, but you didn't know who you were going to hit. You can't really aim.
How far did they go?
Whatever.
Did they strike any ships?
It's really the threat of it.
Oh,
that
the
the
threat
British
of it. Okay. All right.
and the ships, just like the guns in the city of Boston, couldn't shoot up.
Okay.
So you couldn't have a fight of cannon on cannon. The ships would be a
I
sitting
remember you
duck.
saying that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We had a question here about the distance it could be fired with the cannons.
24 pounders. I am not sure that I can give a number, but you could from Leechmere Point hit downtown Boston. From the heights, you could hit towards the center of Boston, but really the harbor. I'm not sure what number of yards that would be.
Quite a long ways.
It is. And the 24 pounders were basically the biggest in service at the beginning of the war here on either side. That would be equivalent to most of the guns on the warships would have been smaller than that. They had some 24 pounders depending on what size of British ship it was. But that really was like the max. Yep.
I heard you mention, did you mention Chelsea Creek skirmish?
That was with the schooner where they got the mast. Yes.
Yeah, we have some friends from Winthrop. We were recently at, they said there was a skirmish at Deer Island, Winthrop, Shirley Gut. Have you ever heard of that? They called it Battle of Shirley Gut or something like that.
That, which is the right cutoff part in the upper right-hand corner, that would be one of those island raids of trying to capture supplies and stores and the cattle that they could come. In that case, you could not cross over from the other side, but you could cross over from the Winthrop side, again, basically across mudflats at the certain tide, or at least with a very tiny boat to some other islands at the lowest tide.
Yeah, I was born in Winthrop and lived in East Boston right there, Hog Island. And it is an interesting story because the British were trying to, well, I guess they had cattle and feed out there. And anyway, it's a nice story.
It seems like the real hero of this story is General Knox. Here's a bookseller who sort of learns to be a military man, I guess by reading books, and devised this whole technique of moving the cannons, particularly over the mountains in western Massachusetts that he did. And I think not only was he the principal person for this battle, but for future battles, he was Washington's artillery general. And it's amazing how, I guess it's sort of the Yankee self-made man, you know, he reads a book and figures out how to do things.
He was entirely self-taught, and the guy who originally had been in charge of the artillery, was it Girdley, was more trained but less good than the self-taught. He was also wicked unpopular. Nobody really liked Girdley somehow. I'm not some personality conflicts. But yeah, Knox, you're right. He sold books. He ran a bookstore, and then he's the one who comes up with this plan. It's amazing, and as he continues, he really closes a gap that the Continental Army doesn't have. At the beginning, their two flaws are, number one, they don't have a navy, so that's a big flaw. But they don't have the heavy artillery. It is the other part of it, and he's able to close that gap. And without it, yeah, you're right. Not just here. I mean, it really matters here. But the future battles would be much less uncertain, or much more uncertain of their outcome. And the Americans can't really produce the artillery. It's captured. It's captured from ships that they take off the coast. Here, it was captured from a fort. And the same was true of their gunpowder shortage. There was not a single factory in America making gunpowder. That's why that shortage was such a problem. So all their gunpowder they just steal from the British here and there, just like their cannon. They all had to steal from the British, scavenge somehow.
Geographical. What is the road that goes to the south of Boston? Where is that road, and what is it connected?
Like today?
Yeah, oh yes.
I heard that, the expressway.
It's quite
So
different.
it would come through the south end. It is Orange Street. And there's, as you're coming through into the south end, the gate. So was it Orange Street's parallel to what's now Washington Street, I believe there. When it crosses Mass Ave coming into downtown Boston, there's then an area where there's two square parks on either side. One's like Benjamin Franklin Park. I don't know the name of the other one. The gate would have been there. But that was the one and only road. I forget what it's called when it's in Dorchester on the other side of the gap there. One thing that I would recommend for like any history of Boston, the Boston Public Library has a really cool map tool where you can have your modern map today and you pick any of their historic maps, and it overlays it.
Oh,
And
that's
you can
cool.
see exactly what is what. It also has expanded to the greater than just the city of Boston area. Being from Danvers, I looked at the Danvers one, and it doesn't quite match up like perfectly. But in Boston, it does, and it's really good. That might be a place to find a better answer than than what I had given.
That's an excellent little piece of knowledge.
Pretty cool.
Okay. I don't know if, I would like to end it, but Alan, would you like to tell the story of Archibald Cox? Would you like to tell the story of Archibald Cox?
Archibald Campbell?
Campbell, okay.
I'll give it very briefly. I don't have the whole story here.
Okay.
Actually, Lee, you might be able to do a better job. No. A couple of months after the British evacuated Boston, there was a transport came in with troops from Scotland. Archibald Campbell was the head of the troops. They rode into Boston having no idea that the British had evacuated, and they had a very small skirmish. One poor guy got killed, and the rest just gave themselves up. And there was no prisoner of war camp or anything around here, so they just spread them all over the countryside. Archibald Campbell actually spent about 4 months in Reading at the Parker Tavern. And the idea was that he couldn't go more than half a mile from the tavern. That was what the jail was. And he used to run parties on Sundays up on a hill in Reading called Scotland Hill today. And I understand he actually got a couple of votes for selectmen, and that wasn't too popular with some of the people in town.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Why don't we have our refreshments now?